You know, true community among men, it's not just some good idea, and it definitely isn't a modern invention. It is woven into our very creation. Today we're diving into this explainer, exploring a really fascinating framework based on David Barron's book, Micro, Starting Smaller, Going Deeper. We want to uncover what the biblical texts actually tell us about the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of brotherhood. We're going to look at why finding your people isn't just a nice to have, it's literally a survival mechanism.
Just think about the Garden of Eden for a second, right? We're talking about a flawless, perfect paradise. No sin, no suffering, direct communion with God. And yet in the middle of all that absolute perfection, God declared human isolation to be the very first thing in all of creation that was not good. Even before the fall of man, God looked at a guy existing by himself and saw a glaring problem. We were just never designed to be self-sufficient islands.
So, here's the absolute crucial point of this whole explainer. Deep brotherhood wasn't invented by some church committee brainstorming how to fill a Tuesday night on the calendar. Not at all. It is a fundamental design feature, built right into the very fabric of what it means to be human. It's as essential to our spiritual and emotional survival as oxygen is to our lungs. You know, when you deprive an engine of oil, it seizes. Well, when you deprive a man of deep community, his soul starves.
But look where we are right now. We're facing this massive, modern crisis that stands in stark contrast to that original divine design. Today, a staggering 15% of modern men report having zero close friends. Zero. That is a huge jump from just 3% back in 1990. Let's put that into perspective. That means basically 1 in 6 men around you are trying to weather the intense storms of life, their marriages, their careers, their private struggles, entirely alone, without a single lifeline.
Let's kind of compare how we typically try to solve this isolation versus the actual biblical model. Church programs, Sunday services, they're fantastic for broad education and corporate worship. But structurally, they just aren't designed for raw honesty. I mean, you can't really bear someone's burdens while you're staring at the back of their head in a pew, right? Programs offer excellent breadth, but true biblical brotherhood requires a daily, deep, raw, and intimate connection that a Sunday lobby simply cannot provide.
So, why is this relational gap literally so dangerous? Well, to get that, we have to look back at the Old Testament, specifically at King David. We need to ask ourselves a deeply sobering question to really set the stakes here. What actually happens when a king, a man with immense power, absolute authority, and the favor of God, decides to stop fighting alongside his brothers and tries to handle his life entirely alone? We all know the tragic story of David on the rooftop. But actually, the failure didn't start with what he saw. It started with where he was. When David stayed home from battle in the spring, he wasn't just idle. He was completely physically isolated from his peers. He removed himself from the brothers who would have had the relational standing to ask him the really hard questions. He didn't have a single man standing next to him to grab his shoulder and say, "David, man, what are you doing? Let's go inside."
Now contrast that tragic rooftop isolation with the beautiful, fierce brotherhood of David's mighty men. This was an inner circle so profoundly attuned to him that when David just muttered in passing that he was thirsty, these guys literally broke through armed enemy lines, fought their way to his hometown well, drew water, and fought their way back just to get him a drink. No way, right? But that is the ultimate, mind-blowing example of fierce loyalty. That's the kind of full contact accountability and love that protects a man's soul.
Let's fast forward to the New Testament, because this blueprint really builds here. Even Jesus, the fully divine Son of God, actively chose not to walk through his earthly ministry alone. Sure, he had the masses and he had the 12 disciples, obviously, but within that 12, he purposefully cultivated an even tighter inner circle of just 3 men, Peter, James, and John. He deliberately limited himself to perfectly model the absolute necessity of a tightly knit micro-community for all of us. He brought Peter, James, and John directly into his absolute most sacred triumphs, like the Mount of Transfiguration, where they saw his unveiled glory. But just as importantly, he brought them into his most crushing agonies in the Garden of Gethsemane, asking them to stay awake and pray with them. Really think about the gravity of that for a second. If the perfect Son of God modeled our deep need for close companions in his hardest, most painful hours, how much more do you and I need it?
The early believers, they saw this model and just immediately adopted it as their precise blueprint for living. For them, community wasn't just a, supplemental weekend activity or a nice optional addition to their social calendar. It was the core mechanism of their faith and their literal survival in a pretty hostile Roman world. They knew with absolute certainty they couldn't make it alone, so they engineered their entire existence around being together.
Like in Acts chapter 2, we see they weren't just meeting up for a highly produced Sunday program. They shared their actual, messy, daily lives together in an organic, deeply invested community. The text explicitly says they were continuing daily and breaking bread from house to house. They moved fluidly from living room to living room, sharing their meals, pooling their possessions, and tangibly sharing their very lives with one another day in and day out.
So the crucial takeaway here is we have to move past those shallow, polite lobby greetings. You know the exact ones I'm talking about, where someone asks how you are and you immediately default to the Christian password of hiding, which is just smiling and saying, "I'm fine, brother, totally fine." We have to reclaim the early church's practice of authentic, daily burden-bearing. We have to transition from a quick verbal handshake to actually sharing our real suffering, our genuine joys, and our darkest confessions with trusted brothers.
Okay, so the obvious question is, how on earth do we actually rebuild this biblical brotherhood today in our insanely busy modern lives? I mean, we can't all just quit our jobs and move into the same house. Well, the source material proposes this really powerful, highly structural solution called the microgroup. It's a dedicated mechanism designed specifically to break through the modern barriers of our schedules and our superficiality, getting us effectively back to that original divine design of real, raw connection.
Let's dive into how one of these is actually built. Real community needs 4 specific conditions to grow from casual acquaintance to life-saving brotherhood. First, you need geographic proximity. Because let's be honest, if it's not a short drive, you're just not going to show up. Second, shared values, which provides a common worldview and language for the deep things. Third, shared purpose, a mutual desire to genuinely grow. And finally, openness over time. Because deep trust isn't a switch you flip on day one, right? It's a conclusion you reach after consistent evidence.
So a microgroup actively protects those 4 ingredients through a very specific and rigid structure. It stays deliberately small. We're talking just 3 to 5 men, so there is absolutely nowhere to hide and no crowd to blend into. It meets consistently, every single week, for 90 minutes, allowing the necessary time to actually get past the surface chatter. And crucially, it operates under an unbreakable covenant of absolute confidentiality. What is said in the room stays in the room, period. That is exactly where safety is born.
And during those 90 minutes, the conversation is just incredibly intentional. About half the time is spent holding space for life's intense storms across a man's entire existence. His body, his soul, his spirit, relationships, finances, the whole shebang. The rest of the time is dedicated to wrestling with hard theological or practical questions and making absolutely sure to celebrate real victories. It's a complete 360-degree picture of a man's life, making sure nothing gets left in the dark. And look, this whole structure isn't just some modern self-help strategy. It's totally designed to facilitate that biblical command found in James chapter 5. Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The ultimate goal is moving men out of the shadows of isolation and into the healing light of full contact relationships. Because here is the undeniable truth. Restoration requires us to actually know what needs restoring. You cannot heal what you refuse to reveal. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought to challenge exactly where you currently stand in your own relational life. I want you to be entirely honest with yourself right now. Who in your life actually knows what you are going through? Who knows the struggles in your marriage, the underlying fears in your career, the hidden temptations in your private life? Not the polished Sunday morning version of you, but the real, totally unsanitized truth.
If the answer to that question is no one, well, it's absolutely time to change that. We were originally designed for deep, authentic brotherhood, for sure, not isolation. So I strongly encourage you to take that absolute next step. Go visit www.micro.faith to learn how to reclaim this divine blueprint today. Step out of the shadows, find your mighty men, and experience the profound healing that only comes from being truly known. Don't fight your battles alone.